That music means it is time for Talk of the Bay, KSQD's evening program of all things local. What's happening in your own backyard? What's the history, the natural history, the human history, and the current events going on right in your own backyard that might affect your life and the lives of your neighbors? I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. Welcome to the program. My great pleasure to be here at K-Squid and to welcome lots of folks on this first segment. In the studio, we have Julie Sidell, interpreter for the California State Park System, and she's here with us with also Martn Martinez, who is with UC Santa Cruz. He's a professor of digital arts and media, I believe. He'll probably correct me on his exact title. Also joining us this evening will be Ruth Anne Beutler, a filmmaker, as well as Marion Martinez. Martinez is a member of the Amah Mutsen tribal band, and they're all here to talk about a film that's going to be shown on November 12th at the Mission State Park. And let's start out with you, Julie, and talk about how the interpretation of the missions have changed and why this event this weekend is trying to reinterpret perhaps a broader vision of what happened and what continues to be the reverberating impacts of the mission system on Native peoples.
Right. So of the 21 missions, many of these are landmarks that visitors still come to today across California. And they're very often carrying a very sentimental, romanticized version of mission history that was born out of the early 1900s.
And perpetuated, I might add, by those little dioramas everybody made in fourth grade.
Right. So this not only happens at those landmarks, but in the California school curriculum, or has happened for many years. I think we're in a moment right now where folks from the schools, folks from the state parks, and folks from the missions, to some extent, are really looking at that history and our obligation to tell it in a truthful way.
And age appropriate comes to mind too, because children aren't able to understand things in quite the same way and with the same level of detail that you might tell an adult, depending on who's listening, right? There's different ways of telling these stories. And Martn Martinez, you are a filmmaker. Were you part of making this film as well, or did you just bring it here? What's your role in all of this?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say I'm first and foremost a historian, but I also work with, film and media. And my expertise is on the history of indigenous peoples of the Santa Cruz area. So my book is that came out last year is about that. And so I was actually working with state parks before becoming faculty up at UC Santa Cruz, and that's where we kind of first envisioned, trying to look at a way to kind of update the histories there. I'll add to what was being said by saying that, nowadays, fortunately, we are able to dig a lot deeper with the histories, and we know a lot more than the questions people were asking a long time ago. So what we do know about the actual history of indigenous peoples during this era is just monumentally so much more, and we know a lot more in depth about the genocidal impact of the missions, for example, and so much of that. But we also know the stories of resistance and how people fought back against colonialism during that time period, and we can observe that now. And so I think that there's that's part of the need to kind of revisit the stories that have been told there. And I would say, really, centrally, the most important thing is that Native communities like the Amah Mutsen here in our area and other Mutsen communities throughout the region, but Native communities have been left out of this dialogue historically, right? At the time where the Franciscans were creating these myths about them, Native people were still there, but they were not listened to, they were not consulted, and I think that's the most important thing of this. And this film here is something that is aimed at doing exactly that, right? We interviewed Native people from the community to talk about what the significance of these places are, so that we can hear from them on it. And that's what really the beauty of this film is, an opportunity for visitors to actually hear directly from Native people themselves.
And in just a moment, we'll talk to another person who was involved in the filmmaking. But first, I want to bring into the conversation Marion Martinez.
I'm from the Solosano lineage. My great-grandmother was Asuncion Solosano de Cervantes, and she was the last full-blooded, fluent-speaking Indian to be buried at Mission San Juan Baptista. She's not the last full-blooded Indian, only the last full-blooded Indian to be buried at the mission. She wanted to get permission to be buried there, and they allowed it. So how I found out a little bit more about my heritage also was not from my mother, but from Mr. J.P. Harrington of the Smithsonian Institute. Came out when he found out that she was very ill and about to pass, but she was the last fluent speaker of our language, the Amah Mutsen language. So he came out to visit, and not to visit, but to interview her. She was expected to only live 3 days, but he came in October of 1929, and she just talked and shared with him, and she passed in January 30th of 1929. So he had gotten language, culture, stories, everything that he could from her. And that's how I learned about my heritage. And so being involved with the tribe, that's when I started putting my history, my ancestor chart, my who I am, so to speak, my roots into the tribe.
That's a fantastic story. Now, are these audio recordings of your great-grandmother?
No, they're actually hard copies that we received, from the Smithsonian Institute.
So a transcription of what she said, right? And
Yes.
were you able to learn any phrases or language or customs from what you read?
Yes. Actually, there was a dictionary that was actually published with the help of UC Berkeley and Davis. So Mr. Harrington's notes actually he was pretty protective of his notes. So he used symbology, he used different ways of writing his notes. And my mother actually was a secretary of his. And so she had worked with him. She didn't really explain the work that she did with Mr. Harrington. It wasn't until after we started working with our tribe and finding out about our history that I realized and that we learned what my mother's role was with Mr. Harrington and how she kept the notes for him.
Wow, thank you for that story. And I want to come back to you in just a moment. And before we do, I'd like to bring in Kanyon Sayers-Rood of the Indian Canyon Nation.
Of Indian Canyon Nation, daughter of Anne Marie Sayers, daughter of Elena Sayers, and caretaker of Indian Canyon.
Is your mother still around?
My mother is happy and content in Indian Canyon in a log cabin off the grid, right there in the Gabalin Mountain Range, right in the heart of the canyon, which is the only federally recognized Indian country between Sonoma and Santa Barbara along central coastal California. That being said, President Taft identified my great-great-grandfather as a California Indian of the Chular Mountain Range in the Mutsen linguistic territory of what we contemporarily call Ohlone lands. So we're on the only federally recognized Indian country, and my mother is just happy and warm with a wood-burning stove, doing well this evening.
I'm happy. Please give her our regards. I've known about her for years and read about her work. I would like to ask both you and Marion to reflect a bit, first you, Kanyon, about the history of the missions and how the state parks have, up until recently, interpreted them to the public and how you're trying to flesh out the story more. Could you talk about the significance of this film and this event in that process?
I am so happy to witness a project like this transpire because I, as a California native, recognize my privilege being raised on the land of my ancestors. However, many institutions and agencies will only touch the surface nature of many topics, because genocide and bad behaviors of both the crown and the church have a unique history that some people feel is challenging to present to the youth and to schools. So a lot of pieces of history are rarely ever shared. And so I am very honored and humbled to finally see organizations and agencies take these steps to talk about a heavier history and involve indigenous peoples, because when it comes to our histories, our narratives, our perspectives, the topic shouldn't be broached. Nothing about us without us. So I'm honored to be a part of and included with to talk about these topics, because it's so very important that we honor truth and history, no matter how uncomfortable it is.
Thank you. At this moment, it feels particularly cogent to be thinking about these things, about history and how its long ripple effects on us all keep on reverberating up through the present time as we're watching genocide around other parts of the world, and yet we don't always talk about our own history with that. What's one thing you would like to see changed about the interpretive arrangements at these missions? I know there was an effort to remove some of the mission bells from along the El Camino Real along California completely. So I'm wondering if that's one thing you'd like to see, and what else? And I'll ask Marion the same question after you, Kanyon.
Truth in history, the uncomfortable facts. The closest mission to us is San Juan Bautista, to Indian Canyon, that is. And I've always appreciated an agreement we have with San Francisco State University, having I coined it the anti-docent tour, where the teacher asked very pivotal questions about who built this mission, what years, how many people, from what territories, what language did they speak, how did their actions or efforts influence the efforts and momentum of progress in the environment. It took me until 2 weeks ago, or the beginning of the first week of November, for me to see a mission that I'm actually really proud of, and it's down past Chular Canyon on Jolon Road. I believe it's Mission San Antonio, where they had a reasonably comprehensive curated like both ethnobotanical display and cultural display. However, it still was taking ceremonial objects and putting them on display. However, that could easily be done with recreated and replicated items, where it's still a tangible item that represents what traditionally or culturally would have been used in those in-between times, to show people something that's hands-on, or something similar to East Bay Regional Park's Coyote Hills public display and interpretation, because the history before the missions is so very important, and the perspectives of indigenous peoples, all layers, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the communities who were married there, the documents and the records that were kept there that help our community connect and get together, also the challenging, unpleasant truths of the punishments and the rampant rates of syphilis and the bad behaviors, so we can talk about this and get it out there, so we don't replicate the problematic behaviors of the past, and we don't dismiss people's perspectives and lived experiences of that intergenerational and ongoing, as well as historic trauma. So
Thank you.
We need to talk about these things.
Absolutely, and thank you. Stay with us. We're going to come back to you. Marion, same question to you. What are one or two things you'd like to see done differently to bring in the Native perspective into the mission interpretation at these state parks, locations around California?
One of the things are actually sometimes in the gift shops. There'll be a clerk working, and someone will come in and they'll say, I've heard this stories about how the natives were treated, and what do you say? And the cashiers will say, oh no, don't believe that. That is not what happened. I would like that cleaned up. That the clerk would be a representative of the mission. And so these people are hearing this, and they are not informed, and then they're going out thinking, oh, this really didn't happen. And even with the mission bells, I had found out that was more of like the natives had these trails and these roads already for years and years and years that they were using them. But then when Southern California, they said, we need to make some more. It was some more money on some of these things. These missions needed to be kept up. They needed, add roads or paint or whatever they needed. And so they said, okay, let's do a mission bell, and we will do the missions along. So it kind of romanticized how and what the really the bill was for. There was bills in the mission that said, okay, get up, eat, go to sleep. There was a different reason for that. And so I would like that cleared up as well. And I have not been to that mission San Antonio, but that sounds like a good place for me to visit
Right.
and find out a little bit more for myself.
Thank you. That's Marion Martinez, the Amah Mutsen tribal band.
Yes, ma'am.
I believe some of them have been removed, and one of them, if I'm not correct, was stolen. Is that right? Can anyone?
Yes.
Do you know anything about that?
Well, we went there to have the what is it?
It was a removal ceremony, right? To have one.
That's correct.
Mhm.
So during the night before the ceremony, someone came in and stole it.
It was
So
almost a missed opportunity, though, then, because they kind of robbed the ritual of its symbolism before it got to happen. I felt that was unfortunate,
that
simply
was
because, yeah.
no, excuse me, I'm sorry. That was very unfortunate. However, they were able to get a mission bell just as a symbol. So we had that in our ceremony, in our presentation, but
Wonderful.
it wasn't the full what we were expecting and what we wanted to have done.
Yeah. And it brings up all kinds of issues. There was this big, big debate, and continues to be, about the naming of things and who they're named after and what those people did. And one question, that comes to mind, which we can't answer here in the next 10 minutes, is, do we leave these symbols and interpret them, or do we just get them out of the way because they're so offensive, because their meaning is so loaded for people? And that's a really big debate that I think Julie Sidell probably struggles with. She works for the park system. I don't know what you have feelings.
Absolutely. And then in the midst of this plan for removal of all the publicly erected bells in Santa Cruz, Martn and I worked on a project that I hope will help the public to with that discourse. It's a virtual bell exhibit available from our website, and it goes through history and really helps people think about how that object has been a symbol of different things with different connections for different groups of people over time, including for Native people today.
Thank you. I'd like to bring into the conversation Ruth Anne Beutler, the filmmaker of this film that's going to be shown on November 12th. Let me ID the station and all of you. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman. This is K-Squid, your community radio station. The program is Talk of the Bay. That was Julie Sidell, Interpreter 1 for the State Park System at the Mission State Park here in Santa Cruz. And I have Martn Rizzo Martinez, who is a filmmaker and PhD professor up at UC Santa Cruz in film and digital media. Also on the line, I have Marion Martinez of the Amah Mutsen tribe, Kanyon Sayers-Rood of the Indian Canyon Nation, and Ruth Anne Beutler, the filmmaker who's made this short film that will be showing this Sunday at sometime around 3 o'clock, I understand, 3:30, right, at the Mission State Park.
Hi, I'm Ruth Anne, and hello to Martn, Julie, Kanyon, and Marion, and you, Rachel. It's wonderful to hear your voices.
Thank you. Can you jump in here and tell us why you felt this film was important to make? I mean, you probably don't need to answer that in some ways because we're in the middle of talking about it, but what did you feel like a film would contribute that, say, a bunch of public speakers like you're also having might not? What does it do in terms of storytelling to maybe balance out some of these stories that we're talking about?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And just want to give folks a little bit of background on this project that it really grew out of relationships that had been built over time. I recently finished my MFA at UC Santa Cruz and had the privilege of working with the Amah Mutsen tribal band to document some of their land restoration work in Año Nuevo State Park. Martn focused his PhD studies at Mission Santa Cruz, also had very strong relationships with most of our film participants. And obviously, Julie's been very engaged in this work for a long time as well. We had a great advising team that included Chairman Val Lopez of the Amah Mutsen Tribal Band and Dr. Sim Schneider from UC Santa Cruz Department of Anthropology. He's just a wonderful Native Californian archaeologist who thinks and writes about the mission's time period and the way that it actually is part of a much longer thousands-year-old history that continues to the present of Native Californian life and culture. And so we were really fortunate to be able to tap into just some very deep knowledge from our filmmaking team, from our advising team, and also, of course, the film centers on the lived experience and the perspectives and the personal and family histories of our 5 participants who were just so generous and in their conversations and their interviews with us in speaking about many different aspects of these histories that connect to their personal, familial, religious, even backgrounds, as well as their cultural backgrounds. And so the challenge in making a 10-minute piece that tries to incorporate so much deep material, I would say, is a large one. And, through the process, we were very mindful that this is a 10-minute piece. It's very short. It's going to be projected on an ongoing basis at Mission Santa Cruz. People will have the opportunity to see it for years to come, and knowing that we can't encompass the whole history, but our hope, my hope as a filmmaker, was to be able to create something that would accurately reflect and speak to the visitors about the experiences that all of our participants were sharing, and knowing, as I think the film clearly acknowledges, that this is only a first step for people, and just hoping that it's an experience, an encounter that will create opportunities, and that people will really accept the responsibility to learn more, because there is so much more than a 10-minute film. But hopefully it's something that will put people on a first step of awareness, learning, discovery.
Wonderful. Well, again, that's showing at the Mission State Park this Sunday, and I think the whole event is like 3 till 6. Is that right, Julie?
So at 3:30, we're going to be serving refreshments. Our visitor center and park store will be available, and hopefully we can hobnob and chat together. And starting at 5, we'll gather for speakers, and as it gets dark, the screening of the film. And that's going to be followed by a Q&A, a panel with the participants and Ruth Anne and the filmmaker. So dress warmly. It will be outside, but it'll be a great opportunity to stand in solidarity and so show support for the people who came out to make this film and tell their stories.
I was going to ask in a final quick round, because we only have a few more minutes, and I'll start with you, Martn, because we began with you a little while ago. How do you think these 2 different ways of telling stories, maybe, the white settler way of thinking about linear time, and maybe a more holistic Native way of looking at storytelling from a different angle, how do these 2 kind of worlds of the historian and the individual, maybe person who's looking at their family history, interact? And I know that's a really big question for the end, but just a few of your thoughts on how to merge these 2 worlds and tell a story in a way that the public, can understand.
Well, I'm going to come at it maybe from a slightly different angle, but I think this is important context. At the beginning, Julie mentioned there's 21 California missions, and 18 of those are kind of owned and run by the church, and only 3 of those are run by the state itself through the state parks. And I think, to circle back to what you're asking, I think that this is a time where we're finally starting to see the stories being told and shared from indigenous perspectives, and those perspectives have always been there, but they just haven't had kind of the platform or the attention given to them. I think, as Marion mentioned with her great grandmother's, all these interviews. I mean, there are 6,000 pages of her stories that are so rich with so many really important stories that are there, and she is one of many others who also related those. So I think that, to shift the pendulum back, to have a film now where we can listen, so where visitors to this, Santa Cruz State Park here can, walk in and hear directly the words being spoken, see people, see indigenous people's contemporary telling them, what they think. I think that it hits a lot harder. I think that it really does a lot to kind of shift things in the other direction. I think that's how I would answer that.
And I forgot to say that the name of the film is It Needs to Be Told. And I want to close with Kanyon and Marion just giving us a couple of words of thought about why it needs to be told. Kanyon, you first.
We need more culturally sensitive and culturally competent environments to encourage listening and learning opportunities, because we are still here.
Thank you for saying that. Kanyon Sayers-Rood of the Indian Kanyon Nation. And Marion Martinez, your final word here.
We are still here. Our voices still need to be heard. And we thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
I look forward to hearing you this weekend. And thanks for being a guest here on Talk of the Bay. We really appreciate your time and your attention. Thanks so much. And thanks to Ruth Anne Beutler for making an appearance on the show. Thanks to my guests. We have Martn Rizzo. Thank you so much for being here. And also Julie Sidell. Thank you all for being part of Talk of the Bay. We appreciate it.